Hi there. Back in the 70s, there was a group called the Eagles. They had a hit song called Take It Easy, in which the lyric, "I've got to know if your sweet love is going to save me," appears. Clearly, they believed in the redemptive power of love. Apparently, Richard Wagner also believed in it. In the 1840s, he wrote a whole opera dedicated to this idea, The Flying Dutchman. It is sometimes referred to as the first of his three romantic operas, along with Tannhauser and Lohengrin. They were composed earlier than Wagner's famous Ring Cycle or last season's smash hit, Tristan and Isolde. Can you even call an opera a smash hit? How about loved by critics and audiences alike? Well, we are in for another Wagnerian treat this season with The Flying Dutchman. Now, last year, I pointed out that some people had qualms about Wagner operas because he was such a despicable human being. They react to his egotistical personality, fiscal irresponsibility, his marital infidelity, and his blatant bigotry. A CBS Music blurb stated, "In all likelihood, no one's ever going to take the title of most horrible person ever to write renowned classical music away from this guy." After last year's presentation on Tristan and Isolde, several people challenged me to explore the subject more deeply. And the Flying Dutchman being in this year's festival season, well, now's the perfect chance. I've done more research, and here is some of what I found, and you can decide for yourself. At issue, among other traits, is Wagner's anti-Semitic writings. It is true that he was not a particularly rabid anti-Semite for his time. Not that it's a justification, but his kind of bigotry corresponds to a common cultural trend in Germany during the 19th century. And despite his very public views on the topic, he doesn't really obsess over them. These unsavory opinions seem to represent his conspiratorial mindset. This is how Wagner explains his setbacks or the limited appreciation for his music. Yet, it does get confusing. On the one hand, his posthumous adulation by Adolf Hitler personally gives me the creeps. On the other hand, throughout his life, Wagner had Jewish friends, colleagues, and supporters. Go figure. For many critics, the key question is this: does Wagner's bigotry inform his operas, or can this art be separated from his unsavory character? The German magazine Der Spiegel published an article entitled "Wagner's Dark Shadow, Can We Separate the Man from His Work?" This article concluded, despite our uneasiness, for many people the two in fact can be kept apart. Jakob Katz, in his book, The Darker Side of Genius, Richard Wagner's Anti-Semitism, concurs with that previous opinion. He provides a comprehensive and judicious view of Wagner's work. Katz concludes that Wagner's actual creative output is untainted by his bigotry. What can be found is not historically rooted, and the so-called connections arise from forced speculation. In 2023, in a current edition of Atlantic Magazine, Judith Shulevitz reviews Claire Dieter's book, Monsters, A Fan's Guide. The book is not about Wagner per se, but rather about artists from a variety of disciplines whose personal lives have brought them censure, but who nonetheless create great art. Dieter concludes that the art is greater than the artist. You will have to decide for yourself. Obviously, if you're watching an Opera Insight video, you're open to new information, so you can make up your own mind. And I applaud you. Because you see, in addition to all these expert opinions, I talk to many of you opera goers who have opinions of their own about Wagner's personal beliefs and his operas. It turns out that people are quite relativist when it comes to the art they enjoy. It reminded me of a season not so long ago. No, not an opera season, a baseball season, when the San Francisco Giants slugger Barry Bonds was chasing the single-season home run record. He was bloated and bulky and accused of juicing, that is to say, using steroids to build his muscle power. Now, when surveyed, baseball fans around the country were pretty much divided 2-1, certain he was using drugs, while fans in the San Francisco area were just the opposite, 2-1 in the opinion that their player was not juicing. I think you'll catch my drift. The more you love Wagner's music, a Wagner fan, so to speak, the more you disconnect it from his personal beliefs. And if you really, really, really can't stand the guy, it is very likely that affects your opinion of his music. So think it over. If you're willing to give our great production a try this season, I truly believe you'll be glad to have experienced this innovative, engaging, and inspiring production of The Dutchman. Now, speaking of which, let's get to it. You enter the theater, and there is no ship in sight. Now that's the iconic symbol of the folk story, a captain doomed to sail his ship forever, unless, well, we'll get to that. If you've never been to Santa Fe Opera, I should explain there's no curtain, and the stage is in the full view. So as you enter the theater and find your seat, the stage set that starts the opera is seen by all. Instead of a ship, we see the windowed wall of a corrugated steel like a factory interior. The overture begins with its familiar, rousing music, often performed in the concert hall as well as the opera house. And even if you don't know the opera, you will recognize its heroic opening bars. It jumps into a storm motive before introducing the motives of the Dutchman and Senta, his love interest. During the overture, a young schoolgirl, Senta, wanders through her father's factory. Clearly, she knows her way around, and she has with her a book including the image of the mythical Dutchman. So we can see the romantic origins of her obsession. The opera opening makes the myth of the Flying Dutchman relevant to the narrative before the mysterious sea captain arrives. It explains Senta's later jolt of romance. It has been building in her for years. Before the 10-minute overture concludes, you will be oriented to our story, storm-tossed and ready for the opera. In the overture, we have literally set the stage. Senta's father, Captain Dowland, is not just a ship's captain, but also a captain of industry in his factory. His crew appears, and in the magic of Santa Fe Opera, the factory transforms into the set of his seagoing vessel, and the narrative begins. A storm forces Captain Dowland's ship to shelter in a fjord. Now, because it's a fjord and not an inlet, you know it's Norway, and they are close but not quite home. Dowland described the storm like this: "Then came the blast from the depths of hell. To rely upon the wind is to rely upon Satan's mercy." Now, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, Satan apparently hangs around stormy seas to capture souls. But there's another reason I wanted to pay attention to this line: Satan's mercy. That's an image that actually implies non-existent. Again, in a couple of minutes, we'll meet the Dutchman. We're going to hear about his once every 7-year search for a faithful woman to end his eternal wandering. Now, is faithful woman an image akin to Satan's mercy, that is to say non-existent? Well, we'll soon see. As a point of information, that is exactly the tongue-in-cheek meaning found in an episode in Heinrich Heine's 1833 sarcastic novel on which the opera is based, The Memoirs of Mr. von Schnabelewapski. You might as well rely upon Satan's mercy as rely upon the faithfulness of a woman. Not for Wagner. For him, given his own marital infidelities, psychologically it makes sense that Wagner would project this idealization on a woman. And psychologically, given the fatal consequence of faithlessness, you might think Wagner had at least mixed feelings about women. We'll see how this is handled with Senta, the faithful woman in this production. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We haven't yet met the Dutchman. We just have left poor Captain Dowland delayed by the storm from reaching his home port. You know, This actually happened to Wagner. It inspired the opening of the opera. The year is 1839. The 26-year-old Wagner was working as a conductor of a small theater in Riga. Now, for those of you who have no idea where exactly Riga is, it's a port in the largest city in Latvia. Oh, I see. Some of you don't know where Latvia is. Okay, no worries. It's on the Baltic Sea, northeast of Germany, which used to be called Prussia. And if you pass through Latvia, moving northeast, you're on the way to Russia. Clear? Okay. Wagner's wife, Minna, was not working and she became pregnant. He was running up debts, a lot of debts, and he came up with a plan worthy of his narcissistic grandiosity. He would skip town, flee to Paris, and become rich and famous. But his creditors were one step ahead of the maestro, and they got the authorities to confiscate his passport. Leaving by boat from the port of Riga was impossible. Instead, he and Minna took a dangerous and illegal overland journey through the back roads of Latvia and Lithuania to Prussia. Sadly, en route, Minna miscarried and they lost the baby. But once in Prussia, they made it to a port city and found a ship bound for London. And most importantly to the Wagners, they were able to book this passage without their passports. And just as in the opera, stormy high seas forced the ship to shelter in a Norwegian fjord, and the 8-day journey took almost 3 weeks. The experience of this tempest-tossed journey, hearing the tales of the Flying Dutchman from the sailors, and reading the satirical novel all contributed to formulating the story and music of this opera. In retrospect, a few years later, Wagner himself saw this opera as the turning point in his career. After this opera, he thought instead of being a mere conductor, he saw himself as a poet who wrote powerful words and composed music to match. So, with that said, let's return to the story. Captain Dahlen sought safe harbor in the fjord. He leaves the ship in the hands of his steersman and retires. Next, the crewmen from the Dutchman's ship appear in this production. They are not so much ghostly sailors. They're more like the crew of zombie businessmen. The traditional sailing vessel has been replaced by a large steel container cargo vessel. In support of this interpretation, the original Dutchman ship in the legend was the Dutch Vluit. This is a cargo vessel in the days of yore. In this production, the idea of a corporate supercargo ship sailing around the world, doing business, making oodles of money, and polluting the planet. There also appears to be the specter of brides. More about these brides later. Enter our title character, the Dutchman. He's wearing a dark trench coat. He's a chairman of the board type, and he reveals his story. He made a deal with the devil to save him from perishing in a storm. He forfeited his soul and would be doomed to sail on the high seas forever. An angel commuted his sentence. Every 7 years, he'll be blown ashore, and if he can find a woman who will be faithful to him her entire life, he can break the curse and his soul can be redeemed. Otherwise, she too would be doomed. Apparently, the previous candidates didn't make it, and this accounts for the ghostly brides. Now, you recall the idea of the faithful woman in the memoirs of Schnabel-Lewopsky. It was meant to be an ironic joke. You are as likely to find a unicorn as a faithful woman. By contrast, Wagner takes the quest seriously, and the Dutchman has been blown into the same fjord as Dahlen. And this cursed captain is on his once-in-7-year quest for the perfect bride. Dahlen enters and meets the Dutchman. He finds out that Dahlen has a daughter, Senta, and offers a treasure trove of a dowry. And, given the possibility of unimaginable riches, the future father of the bride-to-be accepts. Meanwhile, we return back home. The women are working in the factory. There are wheels, but these are more wheels turning water pressure rather than the traditional spinning wheels of the usual production. Senta knows the factory backwards and forward. She knows how it works and she helps to keep it running, but she also is a daydreaming outsider. The workers are drawn to Senta's world of fantasy and dreams. Senta still obsesses about the Dutchman's tale. She loves his picture and vows to be his redemption. Eric, her suitor, arrives. He's a hunter and not of the sea. He asks for reassurance. She likes him, but her heart belongs to the fantasy lover. Eric is left alone with Senta. He shares his unsettling dream. In it, she goes off with a ghostly stranger. She's not unsympathetic to him, but she does put him off. A discouraged Eric exits. Dowland arrives with the Dutchman, the man of her dreams and of Eric's nightmares. She is stunned, and at this dramatic moment, it's lights out for intermission. Now, in other operas, like Peleus and Mélisande, time passes between scenes. Even months will have passed. Here, no time has passed in the story, and after intermission, the lights go up on the frozen moment where we left them. The Dutchman proposes. He explains if she accepts and proves unfaithful, she would be damned forever. However, without hesitation, Senta accepts his proposal. Her father is delighted. Dowland believes she will be happy and secure, and he will be rich beyond his wildest dreams. In Act 3, a pre-wedding party is in full swing. Colorful dresses, lots of beer, Norwegian dances, and carryings on. Then the nightmare crew of the Dutchman breaks into the party. We see the damned brides. The townfolk finally catch on that they're ghosts and they're terrified. But the party crashers clash and then disappear. Senta arrives, dressed for her wedding. Eric enters and tries to convince her that it's a big mistake. He recounts their courting and the implication that she would be his love. Not so, says Senta, and besides, it's too late. She's determined and committed to the Dutchman. The Dutchman overhears the conversation and sees her connection to Eric as something that is already tending towards infidelity and calls off their wedding. The Dutchman said he really thought she was the one. He loved her. Thinking her soon to be unfaithful, he lets her out of her promise to marry and decides never again to set foot on earth. Like Tosca, his jealousy has created a distorted and destructive love triangle. Maybe he has been doomed from the start never to find love because he couldn't trust it. Senta will have none of it. She knows she must be faithful until death, so death it will be. She's not despairingly suicidal. Instead, she's making the ultimate sacrifice to redeem her beloved. And in doing so, the Dutchman will be redeemed. She takes her life. His ghost ship catches fire and sinks, but he remains. Perhaps the spirit of his greedy business lives on. Now, in the traditional versions, they rise together as redeemed and transfigured and ascend to heaven. But in this 2023 version, will there be a happily ever after, or should I say, a happy hereafter ending? Does love have the power to redeem the man or just end his curse? Just like we get to decide about how we feel about Wagner personally and judge his transcendent music separately, we also get to choose our takeaway from the opera's conclusion. Does our love only have the power to redeem another, or do we redeem ourselves by loving? How about both? The music of the Flying Dutchman inspires us to feel both the redemptive power of our love and also our ability to redeem ourselves by loving. We have the ability to redeem ourselves by loving. In the next segment, Opera Insight explores a different type of passionate love with Peleus et Mélisande. See you then.